70,000 people are here, and then Bob Dylan is the reason for it.
Inspired by the true story.
For anyone who's gonna hold your attention on a stage, you have to kind of be a freak.
Are you a freak?
Hope so.
And starring Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. He defied everyone.
Turn it down!
Play loud!
To change everything.
Make some noise, BD.
Timothée Chalamet, Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Monica Barbaro. A complete unknown. Only in theaters Christmas Day. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Hello again, listeners. This is Annie Rose Malamet, and you're listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo. And I'm here today with my friend Micha Malvada, talking about a classic of French horror cinema. Of course, Les Yeux Sans Visage, Eyes Without a Face from 1960, directed by George Franju. But before we get into all of that, hi, Micha.
Hi, Annie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. If I sound a little exhausted, it's because yesterday Micha and I recorded over an hour of this episode, and I realized an hour in that Misha's audio wasn't recording. So we're doing it over again. We're trying to recreate that conversation that we had, and that has not happened to me in almost 5 years of podcasting. So I'm blaming Mercury retrograde and Friday the 13th, but that was crazy.
That definitely crazy, but I think we were cursed by Friday the 13th and Mercury retrograde, and I'm telling Annie that it gave me more time to consider my thoughts about this, so it'll be even better today.
It was our dress rehearsal.
Exactly. So
before we get into the movie, Micha, could you tell the listeners about who you are and what you're about?
Absolutely. My name is Micha Malvada. I am a New York City-based pro and lifestyle dom, leather dyke, evil bitch, creative producer, and artist specializing in photo, video, and performance work that highlights power dynamics, sadomasochism, fetish, and fantasy. I'm also an admirer of Annie's and Girls, Guts, and Giallo, and I'm so excited to talk about one of my favorite movies today.
Yay! I'm so happy to have you, and I love your bio. I love how you describe yourself as an evil bitch, because
that's what I'm about.
Yeah, evil bitch solidarity.
Yes.
So, when did you first see this movie, Micha, and what were some of your first impressions of it?
Yeah, I first saw this movie when I was 20. I had just moved to New York. I was exploring getting jobs. I had just started pro-doming in person, but I was also working part-time at a photo studio. So I had a lot of coworkers who were film students and photography students who, we had worked long shifts and spent a lot of time kind of talking. And I talked about how I had been such a horror fan for all my life. And one of my coworkers suggested this film to me, basically just saying, this is I think you're going to love this. This seems like everything you like. And I went home and watched it alone in my bed at 3 a.m. with all the lights off, which I think was probably the perfect way to introduce this movie to myself. And I just remember being so absolutely into it the second that it starts, and just so enthralled and drawn to the Gothic cinematography and themes, as well as the surrealism and the gore and the creepiness of this.
Yeah, it's a really arresting film. I think on my part, the first time I saw this was maybe in college when I was in film classes, and I took a class that was just like history of French film. So I think this is one of the films that we watched, and I was just so taken with it, and I've seen it many times since, and it's always just a really arresting, singular piece to me. I didn't know a ton about George Franju before I started doing research for this episode. I'm using the George Franju book by, I'm sorry to maybe mispronounce her name, but I think it's Kate. It's Kate Ince, so maybe Kate Ince or Kate Ince. But she wrote a book about George Franju, so I'm getting most of my biographical information from that book. Did you know anything about him, Misha, before doing research for this episode?
I did not know much about him, other than kind of, the things that I noticed about his style watching this. But yeah, diving into it, I was really excited to learn more about him.
Yeah, so I learned that in the early 1930s, he got his start painting stage sets, which I think, really tracks for this film. It's very like theatrical and almost kind of painterly, and I just think it makes a lot of sense that he got his start doing those painted sets for theatrical productions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I feel like I see that a lot in the cinematography and the setting of this as well. There's like a lot of, big kind of empty spaces that feel very much like something you might create on a stage.
So Franju meets Henri Langlois via Franju's twin brother. So George Franju is a twin. And the two cinephiles founded the Cercle du Cinéma, which was an organization that screened films and encouraged informal debate about them at each session. The very first session of the organization was actually devoted to horror cinema, which was a very maligned genre at that time, and still is in many ways. And in 1937, Langlois and Franju co-founded a journal called Cinématographe. There were only 2 issues, but one of these was published, the most important piece of criticism Franju ever wrote, which was about the German director Fritz Lang. So Franju was also a big fan of German Expressionism, which again makes a lot of sense when watching this film. There's those really high contrast, black and white, and chiaroscuro, like shadows, and lots of melodrama. So that made a lot of sense to me as well.
Yeah, I can really see that.
So Franju said in interviews that he greatly preferred collaborative work, which is why he loved working on films, and he had a very egalitarian approach to his working practices, which is very aligned with his politics, which we'll talk about a little bit. And he always called his team his collaborators or his assistants. He also had this collaborative relationship with composer Maurice Jarre, who does the score for Les Yeux Sans Visage, which really distinguished him from his peers. And the personal qualities his collaborators consistently praised in him were his kindness, generosity, and loyalty to his friends, even though he also had kind of a reputation as, I don't want to say an asshole, but like very like brash. Like he was prone to cursing, and just being very blunt. So I think he was one of those guys, one of those people that just kind of comes off meaner than they actually are, which I think Misha and I can really relate to.
Absolutely. Really, really relatable there.
His early films were very anti-capitalism and anti-war. His first film is this documentary called Le Sang des Bêtes, which is The Blood of the Beasts, which is about the violent and disgusting practices of slaughterhouses. And he also made a film called Hôtel des Invalides, which was about veterans with serious injuries from the war, and it was a very anti-war piece. And these early films gained him a reputation for being like ferocious and sadistic because he wasn't afraid to shy away from really shocking and violent imagery. And he's always been very misunderstood and under-recognized as a filmmaker, partly because his relationship to film history is kind of out of sync with what was going on at the time in France. So Franju was heavily influenced by the Surrealist movement, which was pioneered by predecessors that he really admired, like Murnau and Lang, German expressionists. And this rooted him firmly in the cinematic past, which separated him from his contemporaries who were part of the Nouvelle Vague movement, the French New Wave. So, which was very different in style. It was a break from traditional filmmaking that was relied heavily on naturalism and improvisation. And in Franju's view, the Nouvelle Vague was a movement without substance, a little more than a publicity stir created by certain directors and journalists. Kate Insay in her book says about Franju's humanist politics. In Franju's cinema, victims appear in human and animal collectivities and as the main protagonists of his narratives. Franju's political leanings are humanist ones. They do not embrace any particular ideology and are not translatable into the party political system of any country. He is always and only concerned to point out inequality and suffering and to suggest that these derive from the lack of liberty of the individuals concerned. Although passionate about injustice and the inequities produced by social institutions and power relations at work within them, Franju does not explicitly politicize his film narratives. So he makes these very like heavily symbolic and humanist films that also are very nuanced, and I think that's something that people point out a lot in Eyes Without a Face, is that there's not like clear, it's not like a clear villain victim arc. It's very nuanced, and but still with a lot of critique behind it. Franju,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it should come as no surprise that he disliked established institutions like the church and the army, but he was also very critical of the family, as we see in a film like this, where the protagonist Christiane is victimized by the patriarchal family. His narratives repeatedly suggest that the family is governed by an immutable paternal law that is uncaring and corrupt. Slaps, because yes, he went off with that. And he also used a lot of irony and black humor and violence. These are kind of the hallmarks of Franju's films. When he died in 1987, he felt bitterly dissatisfied with the spotty critical reception of his film career. But in the last, I would say 20 years, his body of work has really been reevaluated. But before that, it was, people didn't write a lot about him because he was so out of time and place with what else was going on in French film at that time with the French New Wave movement. So this is Franju's second feature-length film, and it's his first horror film. At the time, modern horror films had not really been attempted by French filmmakers. French horror films tended to focus more on this idea of the fantastique rather than like out and out horror. The fantastique is, I don't know if you know what that is, Misha, but it's this genre. You would be familiar with it if you saw it. It's this genre where the characters are not, and the viewer are not sure if the odd things that are happening are actually supernatural or not.
This episode is brought to you by AWS. Amazon Q Business is the new generative AI assistant from AWS. Many tasks can make business slow, like wading through mud. Help! Luckily, there's a faster, easier, less messy choice. Amazon Q can securely understand your business data to help you streamline tasks, like summarizing quarterly results or doing complex analyses in no time. Q got this. Learn what Amazon Q Business can do for you at aws.com/learn more.
This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
Yeah. I can definitely see a lot of that in this.
Yeah, and this one is more like actually out and out horrific and gory, and which is something we're gonna discuss. So, producer Jules Bourcon decided to tap into the horror market, and he bought the rights to this Redon novel and offered the directorial role to Franju. So there was a lot of censorship issues with this film. To avoid problems with European censors, Bourcon cautioned Franju not to include too much blood, which would upset French censors, and to refrain from showing animals getting tortured, which would upset the English censors, and leave out mad scientist characters, which would upset the German censors. But all three of these were part of the novel, which presented a challenge to adapt it. So first, they were working with the writer Claude Sautet, who was also serving as first assistant director, and he wrote the preliminary screenplay. And then Franju hired this writing team of Pierre Boileau and Thomas Nakajak, who had written novels adapted as Henri Georges Clouzot's Le Diabolique from 1955, which is another wonderful French film, and Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo from 1958. The writers shifted the novel's focus from Dr. Genessier's character to that of his daughter, Christiane, and this shift revealed the doctor's character in arguably a more positive or understandable and nuanced light, and helps to avoid censorship restrictions. On writing the film, George Franju said it had no relation to the original, which was a scenario by Jean Redon and Claude Sautet. The mad doctor was a drunk, and his assistant was a madman who was on drugs and raped the corpses. And I, to be honest, do also want to see that movie.
I definitely would also love to see that version of this.
Yeah. The doctor got arrested at the end, and his daughter committed suicide at the sight of her father in handcuffs. It was too dumb for words. I created the part of the woman assistant and cast Elida Valley in it. I had my friends Boileau and Narkajak collaborate on the screenplay because they were the first writers in the history of crime fiction to emphasize the victim rather than the cops, or the robbers, or the gangster. And I wanted the star of this film to be Edith Scobb, the victim. What she brought to it was magic. She always does. It had been a comic story before with Brassieur, now full of laughs. Now it became sentimental, melodramatic. So Franju felt the story was not a horror film. Rather, he described his vision of the film as one of anguish. It's a quieter mood than horror, more internal, more penetrating. It's horror in homeopathic doses. I do love his description. There is so much anguish in this film, just even in Edith Scobb's acting.
Absolutely.
So Pierre Brassieur, who plays Dr. Genessier, Franju says he was a big stage name, though not a film star. We got Italy by having Elida Valley, and Germany by having Juliette Manuel, because a film she made with Chabrol had done well there. Yet the star was unknown, Edith Scobb, because that's how I wanted it. You can't make those deals in the French industry today. There's just one big distributor, Gaumont. Your lead would have to be a name star to suit Gaumont. So I like that Edith Scobb is an unknown. And in our conversation yesterday, Misha, you made a very good point that it allows, like, it really fits with the blankness of the mask.
Totally. I think it really adds to the sort of ghostly, unknown vibe that she generally just gives off, and kind of not knowing her as a character kind of creates a little bit of a separation from the audience, and makes her just seem so much more creepy and otherworldly.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You can sort of project onto her in a way that you wouldn't really be able to if she was this big star. So we read some chapters in this book called Cutting Edge, Art, Horror, and the Horrific Avant-Garde by Joan Hawkins, which I use a lot in my work. It's a really good book. And she says that Franju's film belongs to a subgenre of mainstream horror films concerned with medical ethics and the birth of the modern clinical method, like Robert Wise's The Body Snatcher, 1945, James Wall's Frankenstein, 1931, and The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. Liz Yu questions the morality of a science that must depend on fresh bodies as the major source of its knowledge. And that quote struck me because we don't really think about in medical history, like the people that had to be guinea pigs, that had to die and be experimented on for us to have the medical advancements that we do have. Like at the time in 1960, the face transplant was fiction. It was like science fiction almost, because that wasn't a thing that could be done at the time. And it only started to really in the 2010s be something that was possible. But you have to think about all of the people that have had face transplants attempted on them, and been experimented on and had it fail, and it sounds really painful. And this film really points out that there are people involved in this process.
Totally, and gives light to that as well. And I think also, as we'll talk about, as highlighted in his first documentary film, but also in this film, the animals and how those can, be an example of animals who had to go through these things as well, but also as a symbol for probably way more people who endured this as well, or people who were seen
as animals
and not even and not even considered, who had to go through these things.
Right. You think about like the history of gynecology and how we only have modern gynecology because enslaved women were being experimented on. And then you think about why gynecology is such, like, going to the gynecologist is such an unpleasant experience. And it's like, well, it was developed on the bodies of people who were not considered human beings. So
exactly.
It's
horrifying.
It's horrifying. And the Western medical industrial complex is
in general horrifying.
Not a kind place. Yeah. As evidenced by this film. And of course, he was supposed to avoid references to German Nazi doctors, but it's difficult to not see those references in the film. So Dr. Genesier appears to be this normal man. He's monstrously rational, and his chillingly inhumane code of ethics makes him a prime example of what Hannah Arendt has called the banality of evil. The film seems to reference German atrocities. So this is a quote from Joan Hawkins again, and I'm just going to read it in full because I found this really fascinating. If the film seems to reference German atrocities, the death camps, it also alludes to French collaboration and French anti-Semitism. Dr. Genesier mutilates women in order to restore his daughter her true face, ton vrai visage, he tells Christiane. But vrai visage is the term that French Nazi sympathizers used during the war to describe French racial and national purity. We Fight the Jew in Order to Restore France to Her True Face, read a 1941 sign at the Institut d'études des questions juives, Institute for the Study of Jewish Questions. And the question here, as in occupied France, is precisely how many people must be removed, how many people must be tortured and killed to restore a true French face, a vrai visage that is always, it seems, constructed from the skin of the other. So that I feel like is really important, because us as contemporary viewers, like living in the 2020s, like you and I did not live through World War II. So it's really easy to miss references like that. Whereas people at the time in 1960, so many more people were alive that had lived through World War II, and that reference would not have been lost on them. Like that phrase, "un vrai visage," like that would immediately recall Nazi propaganda.
Yeah, learning this was really interesting, and I think definitely for viewers was probably a very obvious reference when watching this, because it was so familiar in the way that it was used. But also, I'm like, it makes me think about probably the anxiety or maybe lack of anxiety that Franju would have felt putting this into a film for viewers to see, and like what may have been at stake in making this message. And I think it would be, interesting to kind of know if anyone else working on this, like their thoughts on it,
Yeah, so collaboration was actually a really taboo topic in France right after the war. So you're right that it would have been a risk making something like this. References to the French deportation to Vichy and the French deportation of French Jews was largely downplayed in favor of this theory that during the occupation, the entire nation had supported Charles de Gaulle and the resistance rather than collaborating with the Germans, which was a fiction. There were many people who supported the Nazis. And in cinema, the resistance fiction was promulgated through careful editing and censorship of certain images. So Alain René's documentary about the Holocaust, Night and Fog, from 1955, for example, was withdrawn from the Cannes Film Festival of 1956. And it's a really powerful documentary about the Holocaust. And the reason was that the French government did not want to offend the Germans for something they actually did. It reminds me of today how Palestinian artists are censored or their films are withdrawn from film festivals for telling the truth about what Israel is actually doing to them.
Yeah.
So it's something that happens throughout history.
Totally. I immediately kind of thought of that when hearing that phrase of them not wanting to offend the Germans, and also it being a documentary, and how much we're seeing now, even documentary footage is found offensive or
Exactly.
kind of rebuked, even though it's literally what they're doing to people.
Right. So it's okay to do it, but it's not okay to show it or to tell the truth about it. And that was really wild to me, because I feel like Europe sort of acts like, and Germany, right? Germany, it's like, almost, it's like illegal to be a Nazi, basically. And they're supposedly very ashamed of what they've done, but in that shame, like, there's censorship and rewriting of history. And, Germany is one of the most dangerous countries to be pro-Palestine in, because of their own history with the Jewish people. So I just found that, I was like, yeah, there was a lot of censorship happening post World War II about telling the truth about what had actually happened, even though everybody knew at that point. So Eyes Without a Face also capitulates around the oppression and mutilation of women. And as Hawkins talks about, in post-war France, bad memories of the war and of patriarchal guilt were initially exercised by destroying the looks of women, like shaving the heads of sex workers who were seen as collaborating with Nazis for taking their patronage. In a sense, French guilt over all French collaboration was initially mapped onto women's bodies, and it was women who bore the brunt of the punishment for most of the quotidian traffic in German commerce. Prostitutes were punished for doing business with the Germans. Bakers and butchers generally were not. In that sense, shaved post-war French women stood in for all French collaborators, and their temporary disfigurement served to cover over or mask some of the wider crimes and guilt of the patriarchal homeland. So there's also a commentary here on misogyny.
Yeah, absolutely. And hearing the difference and the way that this is said serves to cover some of the wider crimes, and that being sort of targeted on sex workers who were, I'm sure, survival sex workers working to do what they could at this time. And meanwhile, bakers and butchers didn't have to face this sort of ostracization and this physical punishment for their involvement.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're thinking about like being a sex worker in occupied France during World War II, like what else are you gonna do? It's kind of a crazy double bind. You're really damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You sort of risk death if you don't. This client.
That and the response being the shaving of their heads, I think, is even worse with them being sex workers, because the connection between the physical appearance and desirability of women and how you have to adjust that when you're a sex worker. I'm sure having to deal with, now I'm trying to struggle to survive and I don't have any hair. So
yeah, and you would be known and marked
exactly
as a Nazi collaborator for having a shaved head, because it's not like women just like had shaved heads.
Yeah.
At that time. They still don't really. So even more so post-war. So Hawkins says one of the most disturbing things about the film is the way in which it consistently conflates Nazi medicine with family politics and paternal devotion. Again, that's part of what makes the film so great. So critics didn't know how to categorize it. The Cahiers du Cinéma, which was a French cinema journal, critic Delahaye called it a late Gothic work and struggled to justify Franju's use of what he calls a minor genre, aka horror. Delahaye's use of the terms Gothic and noir are clearly meant to draw a distinction between the kind of sensation horror put out by Hammer Studios and the kind of serious horror that Les Yeux was seen to represent. So Les Yeux became something of a watershed film for the French. It permitted them both to reiterate the high-low dichotomy that exists within the ranks of horror cinema itself and to demonstrate their contempt for British film culture. Spectators dropped like flies when the film was shown in England, the L'Express, another film journal, boasted. And writer Raymond Dugnat cited the film's reception in England as yet another sign that the British lacked taste. Hawkins says in both the French popular press and film journals, Les Yeux always occupied a double niche. Horror, but not hammer horror, not low horror, not horror horror. Franju's film became a sort of cultural lightning rod, a property around which contradictory discourses about horror and art cinema could take place. So, to critics, it was seen as this story of a psychological, individual obsession that spoke to the politics of the family more than the politics of historical racism and war. But I think, since we've talked about the political climate a little bit at that time, it was probably frowned upon to make those comparisons. So they were focusing on the critique of the family as opposed to the critique of the war. When the film came to the United States, it was renamed The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus. Who?
Yeah, who is Dr. Faustus? I need to know.
I guess they like, at the time it was much more common to dub over films than it would be to watch them with subtitles. So the English dub, probably Dr. Genesier, was called Dr. Faustus. And the horrific operating room sequence had been cut. So perhaps for this reason, the cultural and generic discourses surrounding the film appeared even more mixed than they did in France, almost confused. It was released on a double bill in the US in 1962 with this US-Japanese co-production called The Manster, which is a hilarious name because I guess it's the monster, but it just sounds like a man monster, the Manster. It sounds like something like a bro would call his other bro, like, oh, it's the Manster.
What's up? It's the Manster.
And it was this kind of like post-war combination of Frankenstein, Island of Lost Souls, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it was like very much seen as a B movie at the time. So while Dr. Faustus was heralded with language like worthy of the great horror classics of our time, selected for special showings at Edinburgh Film Festival, a ghastly elegance that suggests Tennessee Williams, it was still on this weird double bill with this B horror film and was given this weird sensational title. So American audiences weren't really sure what to make of it. They were also primed for quote unquote low horror, like William Castle, who used lots of gimmicks to market his films, like 3D, skeletons suspended on wires and swung over the heads of the audience. And
sounds great.
It does sound great. I love William Castle. And he would also set up tables in the lobby with actresses dressed as nurses to check patrons' blood pressure. And it was supposed to be like, oh, this movie is so scary that we need medical supervision.
Oh no, I think we need more nurses in screenings, actually.
Yes, please bring it back.
We should bring that back. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to bring back specifically like actresses hired as nurses.
Exactly.
In sexy little outfits. Yeah. That would get me, I mean, I already go to the movies all the time, but that would really get me to go out.
That would get me there early, on time.
So actually, a lot of these gimmicks that William Castle was using are reminiscent of the special effects used in the original Grand Guignol Theater, which was a French theater that specialized in often hokey special effects and gratuitous displays of violence. But in contemporary film theory, Alexandra West, who wrote a book about the New French Extremity movement, she linked Eyes Without a Face to the history of the Grand Guignol and then also linked the history of the Grand Guignol to the New French Extremity genre, and Eyes Without a Face kind of as the progenitor of the New French Extremity genre. So it's all connected. Hawkins says, although the Manster Faustus double bill seems at this remove confused in terms of its cultural codes, it made a certain amount of thematic sense. Not only were both films concerned with mad scientists and the godlike power of an unscrupulous patriarchal male, but they both reflected lingering anxieties about the horrors unleashed during World War II. So this movie, one of the first cities it comes to is San Francisco, and Pauline Kael, who I don't think you're familiar with, Misha, but she's this famous film critic who I really like her writing, but I pretty much always disagree with her, but she's like an essential part of film critic history. And she saw this movie with the double bill in San Francisco, and she wrote a review titled, "Are Movies Going to Pieces?" And she says, even dubbed Eyes Without a Face, which Franju calls a poetic fantasy, is austere and elegant. The exquisite photography is by the great Chouvetan, the music by Maurice Jarre, the superb gowns by Givenchy. It's a symbolist attack on science and the ethics of medicine, and though I thought this attack as simple-minded in its way as the usual young poet's denunciation of war or commerce, it is in some peculiar way a classic of horror. It's a horror film that takes itself very seriously, and even though I thought its intellectual pretensions silly, I couldn't shake off the exquisite dread images. exquisite dread images is a great way to describe this movie. And at the same time, I like really disagree with her that it's simple-minded. I think it's like very complex, and there's so much responding to history going on here too. And maybe she just didn't see that at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think also viewing this without that central scene that was censored from these viewings, I would make it such a different experience as well.
Yeah. So she probably didn't even see that scene.
Yeah.
So she also said the audience seemed to be reacting to a different movie. They were so noisy, the dialogue was inaudible. They talked until the screen gave promise of bloody ghastliness. Then the chatter subsided to rise again in noisy approval of the gory scenes. When a girl in the film seemed to be mutilated, a young man behind me jumped up and down and shouted encouragement. "Somebody's gonna get it," he sang out gleefully. The audience, which was, I judged, predominantly between 15 and 25, and at least a third feminine, was as pleased and excited by the most revolting, obsessive images as that older, mostly male audiences when the nudes appear in movies like The Immoral Mr. Tease or Not Tonight, Henry. They'd gotten what they came for. They hadn't been cheated, but nobody seemed to care what the movie was about or be interested in the logic of the plot, the reasons for the gore. I mean, this is like a very kind of typical old head complaint, like, oh, these kids, like, they don't care about the form and the plot, and
I feel like this definitely also wasn't marketed to people, especially on this double bill, as that. So I find it like less surprising that this is how the audience was, because they're going into this thinking it's this, gratuitous hokey B movie, and then all of a sudden they're getting, this drawn out, very like builds the anticipation, not a lot of like hardcore gore in your face at all times. So I feel like the reaction kind of makes sense. It's a bunch of kids who wanted to go see the horror double feature.
Yeah, they wanted to go see The Manster.
Exactly.
In the horror chamber of Dr. Faustus.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know, like, I'm like, it sounds like she might just not have had a great experience at this one.
Yeah, I mean, the whole review is interesting. I linked it in the notes if you're interested in reading it. But if you listeners at home are interested in reading it, just Google Pauline Kael and Dr. Faustus, and it comes up. So Hawkins also compares Franju to David Cronenberg, definitely a progenitor of that kind of film, and also says that the film can foreshadow something like Psycho in the ways that the horrors play themselves out on the bodies of these female victims as a stand-in for the viewer. But the poetry of the film is what keeps it from being categorized as like a splatter film. The juxtaposition of extraordinary realism and what surrealist Andre Breton calls the marvelous, the anti-bourgeois morality of the film espouses all linked the film to the surrealist movement. Even the expressionist mise-en-scène and cinematography seem surrealist and invoke silent German horror masterpieces like Breton, Franju, and other surrealists loved. The film was widely seen and influential, and French magazines praised it, but it was also adversely criticized in just about every other country it played in. So there is a quick and dirty history of Eyes Without a Face, the making of and the reception. So now we get into our traditional girls, guts, and giallo scene by scene analysis. Are you ready, Misha?
Oh, I'm so excited and so ready.
And I forget where we got yesterday when I realized that we weren't recording, but I'll try to remember all the wonderful things that we said about the scenes of this film.
I have my notes.
So we open on this with this Carnivalesque Maurice Jarre soundtrack, and the credits are rolling over this POV shot of a car driving down a dark tree-lined street. And there's this shot of a woman in the car, and it's raining. And it's hard to see. She adjusts her mirror. And we see that in the back is someone in a hat, like a men's hat and coat, bundled up in the back seat and not conscious. And the carnival music plays on. They get to the end of this river dam, and the woman pulls over her cute 60s Beetle car, and she pulls this body out of the car. We see that it's a woman, and she drags it to the river's edge and dumps the body in the water, and she slowly backs away in her fabulous Givenchy shiny pleather rain trench. We love her.
We love her. I also loved finding out that Givenchy designed a lot of the costumes for this. I think that's a fabulous tidbit.
It makes so much sense.
Also, yeah, this intro scene is probably like one of my favorite intros. Like immediately when I saw this, it drew me in. I think that the score is insane. It's so creepy and, like you said, carnival-esque. It reminded me a lot of the Wicked Witch's theme in Wizard of Oz, and just kind of
totally
like the intensity and the repetitiveness of it as we're getting introduced to this character who seems, fine for the first couple seconds. She seems very anxious, but then you see her like get out of this car and drag a body to the river in heels and a trench coat, and I'm like, okay, I need to know more about her immediately. Like iconic theme intro, and now she's doing this. Like I'm hooked.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like immediately draws you in, and that Maurice Jarre music, that carnival music is like so creepy, and it really links the story to the carnivalesque, which is like such kind of like, I had a whole theme on the carnivalesque for my Patreon. Everybody, you should really join my Patreon, patreon.com/girlsgotsgiallo.
Yes.
And I have different themes that I explore with my patrons, and we watch movies and we read books, and we, everything gets related back to the theme. But the carnivalesque is this way of like, it's very surreal. It's this way of bringing the story like out of this kind of realist mode. Like it takes you into the world of the carnival, which is like a very othered reality. So it really brings us to this certain place, the movie opening that way. So we cut, a man is answering the phone, and the person is on the other line is asking for the professor, but he says he's busy. And then we meet the professor, played by Pierre Brossier, as Dr. Genessier, and he is presenting his research to a crowd of the bourgeoisie, which feels very important because Western medicine is very much gatekept by the upper classes, and people of the lower classes are sort of paraded around as guinea pigs for these bourgeois audiences. So that feels immediately like a commentary, and when we open that way,
totally agree.
And yeah, and it makes sense with George Franju's politics. So he's presenting his research regarding skin grafts, and he's talking about different methods of biological grafting, and he describes this method that kills the organism. I would assume the organism donating the skin, and another method that one must like exsanguinate the subject, like take out all the blood from the subject. So we're immediately like brought into this kind of like medical violence. When the lecture is over, his many admirers come to thank him for his work, and he says, "The future is something we should have started long ago." Which, what do you kind of make of that line, Misha?
I feel like that automatically kind of presents him as he thinks that he's so ahead and has this idea of himself and his work that is so serious.
It's like a god.
Exactly. And I see that even in, it starts with not him, but someone answering a phone for him, which I feel like puts him in this position of, we know that this person is powerful. He's on a stage. Someone else is answering his phone for him, or answering the phone for him to get his messages. That's kind of like where he is in his place. And then he's, presenting to this wealthy crowd who all comes over and flocks. And I think like this work probably, as we said, didn't really exist until the 2010s, this actual surgery. So I'm sure that hearing this in this scenario was like so outlandish and probably not understood by a lot of the people who are receiving it because it's so futuristic. So I think for them, it's probably easy to kind of just think, oh yay, the professor came up with something new, and oh yay, he's done this work, and he can kind of accept this. Yes, I'm right, and I'm already started on the future. I'm doing the best things, and that shows us kind of how he thinks of himself.
Totally. And he's this kind of surly guy, and one of the women says that he's changed so much since his daughter vanished. So now we cut to these two men in what I think is the police department. It says the medical bureau, so I think it's probably has something to do with dead bodies, which is going to come up right now. And they're talking about before his daughter vanished, Genese's daughter vanished, she had gone missing from a clinic, from his clinic. And before she went missing, she had this really intense facial deformity from an accident, where her face was like ripped off. And they're talking about this body that they just found in the river, that we just saw get dumped in the river at the beginning of the film, and how the body also had her face ripped off. But it didn't look like it was torn off. It looks like the skin was removed as if by a scalpel. Dun, dun, dun. So basically Dr. Genese shows up and meets with the two men from the Missing Persons Bureau, and he's going to see if this body is his daughter. So he tells they take him to see the body, and there's this really intense POV shot where they're all walking. We're in their position, and the door opens like as if we're walking through the door. And there's a lot of these POV shots in the film, and it really adds to like this tension, because it puts us in the position of the characters. And the first thing,
absolutely,
yeah, and the first thing we see is this body covered by a sheet, right? And that actually reminds me, now that we're like rediscussing the film because we talked about these scenes yesterday, it actually reminds me of what's going to come up later when Dr. Genese opens up another door. Kind of mimics that scene almost.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So he looks at the body and he confirms that it is his daughter. And there's another father there outside the station who is there his daughter is also missing. This movie is very absent of mothers, interestingly. And his name's Tissot. And he is also trying to see if this body is his daughter. And he confronts Genese outside the building, and he's really distraught and about his missing daughter. And Genese says to him, "I shouldn't have to comfort you because your daughter is still alive. Like, you still have hope." And that he walks away. So next we see these people like streaming out of a building. We're in Paris. There are these two women walking down the street, And all of a sudden, that carnivalesque music comes in again, and we see a woman following them from behind, and we're like, oh, that's the woman from the beginning of the film. That's her theme song. And she's trying to be inconspicuous, but she's following them with this like sinister vibe. So one of my favorite shots is next, where we cut to this gorgeous graveyard.
Beautiful, foggy, creepy graveyard.
Yeah, with that black and white photography, and yeah, it's just a beautiful shot. And it's the funeral for Professor Geniese's daughter, Christiane. And there are these two men talking about how the professor's had bad luck because he lost his wife, actually, and now he's lost his daughter. So we're learning, oh, that's why the mother isn't in the picture. So they also say Paris, fame, fortune, what's it all add up to? Like, it doesn't matter how rich you are with all of that tragedy. The professor looks very haunted as mourners shake his hand. And we also meet Christiane's fiance, who he's a doctor who works with the professor. His name is Jacques. And we see that the woman from the beginning is also there with him. Her name is Louise, and played by Italian actress Elida Valli. And we're seeing that there's a connection between these events. And there's a scene where they're in the tomb of Christiane, and Louise is like, I can't take it anymore, let's go. And the professor slaps her across the face to shut her up. And we're like, oh wow, he's a controlling sadist fuck.
Yeah, immediately. And I think I noticed from in this scene, and as well as the scene before, that the whole time he just has what they describe as haunted, like, feeling over himself, but he just looks so like dissociated to me. Like, he's just out of it. He's so overwhelmed with his feelings before he finds out that it's her, or before he identifies her body, and then through the funeral as well. And then they describe the way Louise looks as that she looks deeply affected by the tragedy. And they both do look so torn by this.
And we're also thinking, though, Louise just dumped a body into the river. What else is going on here with these two? So they're hiding something. They drive off in this stunning car, and they arrive at Professor Genesier's villa. It's a whole fucking villa. He's clearly very rich. It's beautiful, but the cinematography also makes it look very desolate and scary, like very much a classic haunted house. And he opens his garage to this cacophony of dogs barking, which will be very important later. And also, we immediately remember, like, George Franju uses animals a lot as symbolism. And he enters this house, and it's gorgeous, gothic, but it's also very empty and lonely. And he's moving with purpose. The lack of music here makes it really tense. And he's obviously going to a very hidden part of the house. Like, he's going upstairs and he's opening doors. And the music starts to play. And I love when movies do this, when we're like not sure if the music is diegetic, meaning it's coming from inside the movie, or if it's non-diegetic, if it's a soundtrack that the characters in the movie can't hear. And he opens this back room, and we switch to his POV, and we see first birds and these beautiful white doves in a cage. And then we scan over, and there's this woman lying face down on like a chaise lounge, and we push in on her. Professor Genesier turns off the radio, so the music was inside the film, and he grabs a piece of paper, and he's like, where did you get this? I don't want you snooping. We still haven't seen her face. And we see that it's Christian Genesier's death certificate. And they start talking, and he says, I can't explain it to you. It's your name. What can you possibly be imagining? So we're like, oh my God, Christiane is alive. She's alive. and she's distraught. She's like, I'm living horrors. What have you done now? Part of what I love about Christiane's character is like how much she doesn't fuck with her dad. She's like,
and she calls him out for it.
Yeah, she's like, what have you done now? And he's like, it's for your own good. And he explains that since a girl died during his operation, he made everyone believe that the dead body that they found that he killed was Christiane, to cover up this wrongful death. And she lifts up her face. We're seeing her from behind, and we see him recoil in horror. And he's like, where's your mask? And he wants her to get used to wearing it. And he's promising that he'll succeed in finding new techniques to fix her. She doesn't believe him. Louise comes in, and he says, you have no reason to doubt me. He's very commandeering, very controlling, very patriarchal. And I was also thinking now on my rewatch of this scene is also so scary, because not only is she like disfigured and confined to this room, people now think she's dead. So,
and like having to discover that and then grapple with that, like among also having her father tell her like, oh yeah, I killed somebody, but I found this way to
it was for
cover it
you.
up. Yeah, it's fine. And also I think the intro and him coming into this, we see, you know, how big and empty this house is, and how dark and sort of ominous this is as a place where she's now trapped. She can't go anywhere because everyone thinks that she's dead. And, you know, he kind of lurks up as this ominous figure and tells her this situation that she's now stuck within.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Streaming now on Peacock. Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie are back.
That's hot. Loves it.
For a show-stopping reunion that will prove putting on an opera is anything but simple.
We're really good at this.
One thing's for sure, they won't be upstaged.
Good to have you back. Come on, we've got a show to do.
Paris and Nicole, The Encore, a 3-part reunion special. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
Yeah, she's completely under his control. Like the birds in the cage, which is imagery that comes up again. So Louise comes over with this mask, and Dr. Genesier has left, and she says like this really poetic line where she's like, you've taken the mirrors, but I can still see my reflection in windows, in knife blades. Which is just a really striking line.
Yeah.
And she says, my face frightens me, but the mask scares me even more. And Louise says, you know, don't lose faith. Didn't he fix me? And Christiane's like, okay, but you had a face. It was easier to fix you. And she says, he's lying to me because he knows it was his fault. So she was in an accident, and it's because of the father. So it was this car wreck, and she says he has to control everyone, even on the road. So he was driving like a lunatic, and he got in an accident, and it nearly killed her. But it severely disfigured her. And she says she wishes she was blind or dead. And then Louise puts this mask on her. We still see her from behind. And now the camera like moves and we finally see her in this mask. And it's like this really scary blank white mask. I want to take a moment to talk about the mask. It like looks real, but also fake. It's like a mannequin. One of the books I sent you is Alexandra Heller Nicholas's book on masks in horror. And she has a whole chapter on blank masks. And she says blank masks simultaneously erase identity and create spaces to project new meanings onto, prompting another dimension to the visual iconography of horror film masks. So we can project any identity onto this creepy white mask.
Yeah, and it's so blank, and I think it adds to that ghostliness that she gives off and kind of removes her humanity from her in a symbolic way, but also a literal way, in the same way that her father has removed her humanity by making her exist essentially as a ghost in this scenario because she's now assumed dead. So I think that is creepy as well, because she looks, probably similar to how preserved her preserved corpse may have looked in the face.
Yeah, absolutely. It really makes her, and she's dressed all in white in this like fabulous Givenchy house coat.
Yeah.
And Edith Scobb, who plays Christiane, said that I was very surprised to learn this. So I would think like you would just put the mask on, right? And it's like you just slap it on. But it actually took like hours to put this mask on like perfectly. And it was like constantly having to be adjusted. So it was like perfect. And it couldn't be taken off because it took hours to put it on. So she just like, when they were filming this, she just had to wear it all day. And it really othered her from the rest of the cast. Like she was just like she said she was like in the corner, like in this mask. She had to eat through a straw. And it really got her. And people were kind of like, freaked out because there's this person in this creepy mask. And she said it really got her into the mindset of this character because she was like living it, being a ghost.
I hate that for her, but also I can definitely understand how that would lend to her understanding being more alienated in this scenario. I also found this other quote from Masks in Horror Cinema where it says that identities are destabilized in Eyes Without a Face, and Christiane's blank visage is less of a cipher for innocence as it is a slate wiped clean, an identity purified of any traces of a horrible and horrifying truth that lies underneath.
I really love that quote. And I also wonder if I don't have a fully formed thought here, but I wonder if there is like something to be said about masks and the way that we treat like that kind of facial blankness and like how political masks are right now. And again, I don't have a fully formed thought about that. But I think that this kind of like blankness and the way that the mask transforms people's faces is really upsetting to people. And I think there's just something there. I mean, during the height of the pandemic, like anti-maskers were like very anti-mask, partly because they were like, we can't see the individual, like the face, the expression.
I see that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I see that also like very heightened in, I don't know if it's happening in California as well, but I know here there's been mask bans, which there was one in Nassau County on Long Island recently, and I've been seeing them pop up kind of in more places where it's being presented as this oh, we don't need to wear masks because COVID doesn't exist anymore, which obviously is not true. But also is very much what I feel is a reaction to facial recognition and how police want to be able to see our faces and monitor them, and how that, they want us to have it out there, and not be the connection there between how this is. But I think we see kind of the way that people are reacting to people wanting to omit their identities for safety purposes, as we're kind of moving through these like very censored but also very like heavy policed times, where our faces are this new tool for us to be villainized and to be found. Yeah, I'm like, I don't know where my fully
yeah, I don't have a fully formed thought either, but like it felt weird to talk about like the mask and not talk about like how politicized masks are right now.
Totally.
I think they're, there's like different contexts here. Like we're talking about post-war France as opposed to like, 2020's US.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's something there, even before COVID. I know like Asian people used to be mocked all the time for wearing these masks and these medical masks. Yeah. And I think masks function very differently in horror films than they do in like real life, obviously. But there's something there about like transformation and the way the mask like communicates individuality and transformation. There's something there.
Totally.
I'm not ready to write a thesis on it, but there's something there. So it's this totally expressionless mask, but her eyes, Edith Scobb's eyes, say it all. Her mask acting is amazing. Her eyes are so tortured, and they're like looking out in fear from this scary mask. So Louise leaves her alone, and Christiane goes to her door, and she's like listening at the door, and she quietly leaves her room, and she's sneaking through the house, being careful not to be heard. And she really, really looks like a ghost in this floor-length dress coat and white mask, stalking these empty halls. And she enters her father's office to make a call. We see that there's this big mirror in there that's painted black, so she can't see her reflection. Again, like in Judaism, for example, when somebody dies, you cover the mirrors. So it's like really to me hammering home that she's dead, like she's this living dead woman.
Yeah.
And she makes this phone call. There's a man's voice on the other end. We can kind of assume it's her fiance Jacques, and she's just calling to hear his voice, but she doesn't say anything. And she's dead. She can't. And we see this painting of a beautiful woman with birds. And I'm unsure if that painting is her or her mother, but women being likened to birds, and the birds are free in the painting, but like women here being likened to birds, that is definitely like a motif throughout.
Totally.
So we cut again to the carnival music, and we're back in the city, and there's a line of people waiting to get into the theater. And Louise walks up to this one woman, and she says, I have an extra ticket if you don't want to wait in line, if you want to sit next to me. And we see that this was the woman that she's been stalking. And in the next scene, they meet up, and Louise, it's like almost like they're continuing a conversation that they had started previously, where Louise is like, oh, I found you a room. So this woman must have said that she needed a room. So is her name, I forget, I didn't write her name down in my notes. Is her name Edna?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it's Edna. And she's got this like Swiss name. So Edna is asking questions about the room, but Louise is being very like obtuse about the details and very like cryptic. And they drive to the professor's house to go see this room. And Edna comments that it's like very far out as the carnival music is playing. And there's this gorgeous shot of a train going by. And she's like, that's the train you'll take to get into the city. And the girl expresses that Edna expresses that she lives very far from her family. Again, her name kind of indicates that. And so she's this perfect kidnapping candidate. And they arrive at the house, and the professor is like a villain, creepily watching out the window as they pull in. Edna looks very cold and frightened and of how far out the house is. The way everything is shot is very creepy and moody. She mentions the dogs. She's like, how many dogs are there? And Louise assures her that means she's well protected. So she's very hesitant. She doesn't want to go in. She should have gone with that because she's introduced to Professor Genessier. And they're like very pushy with her. Like, she expresses like, I'm not going to live here. This is too far out. And they're like, no, the suburbs, Genessier is like, the suburbs are very convenient. He's like very like pushy and commanding.
Yeah. And she's like trying to get out of there. She's like, all right, like, let's make it quick. And he's just like, what are you in a rush for? Like, you're in the suburbs now. Like, don't worry about it.
And he quickly like chloroforms her from behind and throws the rag into the fire, and they carry her away. So we see it's like a very jarring, also the lack of music. Like, this is something else I wanted to note, because in American horror films, like, the music is really important to indicate to the viewer that like something scary is happening. So in a American film, when he chloroforms her, the music would be like na na na, and in this it's just like all silent, which makes it's very much like banality of evil shit, right? Like, it's just happening.
But we get the creepy intro when Louise is stalking and lurking. So
yes,
the intro to the horror, and then the drawn out silence, I think, adds to making it creepier even.
Yeah, absolutely. So Christiane is again ghosting on the stairs, and she's like looking to see what's happening, and sees them carrying Edna out to this secret room they carry her in, and Christiane is creeping around, and she follows them, and Genessier says, I'll start after dinner. This time I must try removing a larger section. It's very, very eerie. And Christiane, they walk out of the room, Louise and Genessier, and Christiane takes herself into the secret chamber. It's really creepy. She's moving down this dark brick hall, really looking like a ghost. And she opens this metal door to find this like creepy makeshift operating room, which Misha and I both want in our house.
I want the creepy tunnels, and I want the operating room.
Yes. Imagine the possibilities. So this girl is laid out on the stretcher, and Christiane goes deeper into the chamber and opens another door where we see many dogs lined up in cages barking. And this is like a very sweet scene. I feel like it says a lot about her character, where she goes up to each one of the dogs and like embraces them and kisses them in their cages. And it's like she can relate to them. Like, they're both caged beasts. And
with them and relates to them.
Yeah, and she gives them all some affection, and she turns out the light. She closes the door, and in the operating room, she takes off her mask and looks at herself in the mirror. And remember, all of the mirrors are hidden from her, so she can't ever see what she actually looks like. She's denied even, this is a thought that's coming to me now, like, she's denied even the privilege of mourning her own disfigurement. Like, she's not allowed to look. Like, she's always got to have this mask on. All the mirrors are covered. Like, she's really being denied so much agency over her own body.
Yeah. It feels like Genesee is just trying to like hide her even finding out about it. I mean, obviously she's saying that she see it earlier in knife blades and in windows, but he's really going out of his way to try and cover up this mistake that he's made.
I also think it's obviously this movie would be so different, right, if it was a son and not a daughter. Mm-hmm. Like, a woman's face. It's like the hair with the sex workers that we were talking about. Like, a woman's beauty, her face, her hair. Like, it's so loaded for us. And it's like, God forbid, the one thing that makes you valuable as a woman is taken away from you. Yeah. I feel like if it were a son, like, he would be able to look at himself. But all agency is just being taken away from her. So she takes off her mask in this act of agency and looks at herself in the mirror. And she goes over to Edna and like looms over her. And there's this gorgeous shot of her touching Edna's face with both her hands, like very longingly. And Edna opens her eyes and wakes up to see her severely deformed face. And it's like there's this blur on the camera, right? So we're like seeing it through her drugged eyes. And she screams. And yeah, I was wondering, Misha, why do you think that she does that? Like, why do you think she takes off the mask and goes and like looms over Edna?
Yeah, I feel like I kind of pick up on when Genesee says to Louise, like, I'll start after dinner, and, you know, gives this, I must be, you know, removing a larger section. I feel like we are being introduced to the fact that Christiane is also a part of this in the face transplant. You know, she's receiving these as these women are going through this surgery. So she also has to endure these surgeries every time the women go through them. And so I feel like this is her routine. She knows it's happening after dinner. She's made her way. She's, you know, looking over this person who, the face that she might get to have. And I'm not sure, you know, if she wants connection or acknowledgement. I don't know if she was expecting for this victim to awake and see her, or the reaction she was hoping, but it feels kind of her looming down there and going through this process of taking off the mask and standing over Edna's body is like her way, her like ritualistic way of preparing to endure this horror again of the surgery.
Yeah, and this kind of acknowledgement that she's still alive.
Yeah.
Like, she's not a ghost. Her face is deformed, but it's her face. It's hers.
Yeah.
You know, whereas like she's being completely stripped of all her agency. I see like there's a lot of anguish here. There's a lot of like anguish, that word that Franju uses. Like, she, you know, is really conflicted, like, about this woman getting her face scalpeled off to put onto hers. So, but there's also hope there, like maybe it will fix her. Mm-hmm. So now is time for the infamous operation scene where apparently 7 people fainted at the Edinburgh Film Festival upon watching this scene. So the doctor puts on his mask with Louise's help. So Alexandra Heller-Nicholas also talks in her book about how the medical mask transforms the doctor. And Misha, I think you had a quote about that.
Yes. From Masks in Horror Cinema. The surgical mask transforms the mad doctor through surgical rituals into sadistic tricksters. They're deceptive, believe in their own godlike capacities, and invert scenarios where they are meant to heal into ones where they are actively seeking to harm.
Yeah, it turns them into sadistic tricksters. I love that. And he cuts the girl's face very precisely with the scalpel, actually showing the operation, which is really gory for the time. And he scalpels her face off in one piece. And it's so gruesome. We hear him breathing very heavy and we see him sweating. And they lift off her face in one piece. There's no music. And we see her flesh underneath. And like we see everything happening. And it's really disturbing. So that's like the most famous gory scene in this movie, and that's the scene that's really Alexandra West says in her book that really kind of predicts or gives birth to the new French extremity movement. So the professor, after the surgery, he's seen handling his dogs very aggressively. There are more birds in cages down there with the dogs. He's a very like commandeering and forceful, violent patriarchal figure here. Louise comes in and she says his daughter is healing well and that she has faith this time. And Louise also says, "Never forget that I owe you my face." And she lifts up this like pearl choker she's always wearing to reveal that she has this scar on her neck. We're like, we never learn what happened to her. Just that she also had an operation, facial operation. So Edna is still alive. She's in this secret room in like one of the chambers. She's in this bed in a cell and her face is wrapped in gauze. And now she's blank and faceless. And the gauze is almost like Christiane's blank mask. It's really arresting. We see like her eyes just looking out from her bandages. And we don't know how long she's been there. She's on this bed and Louise comes in to like feed her. She's being held prisoner. And she lifts her body up and she like hits Louise over the head with a bottle and runs to escape. The garage starts to open, like Genevieve starts to come home or something, and she enters deeper into the house. And Louise tells the doctor that Edna's escaped. Edna goes higher into the house, and we hear a girl scream, and we see the window of a room open, and we see that Edna has jumped out of the window and dies. Do you think she was trying to commit suicide, or do you think that she was trying to escape?
This episode is brought to you by Skinny Pop Popcorn. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Oh, so light and crunchy. Skinny Pop Original Popcorn is the snack you've been searching for. Made with just 3 simple ingredients: popcorn kernels, sunflower oil, and salt. Snacking never felt or tasted so good. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Give yourself permission to snack and pick up Skinny Pop Original Popcorn today.
Fever, cough, congestion. When the symptoms keep coming, but you've got to keep going, you can rely on Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One. Just 1 dose of Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One relieves up to 9 cold and flu symptoms, helping you get on with your day. Need cold and flu relief? Get Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One and Done Relief. It's comeback season. Use as directed.
I don't know. I think probably I assume suicide. I think in this sense where she's so overwhelmed by this that escaping or dying is probably relatively similar, because now she has to come to terms with this same sort of, oh, now she doesn't have a face. How is she going to go out in the world and and live her life, and how her humanity has been removed. So,
right,
might as well.
Yeah, I mean that tortured scream when she jumps out the window is so upsetting.
Yeah,
and Genesee and Louise are gonna dump her body, and they're basically what they do is they go to the cemetery, and he enters his quote unquote daughter's tomb, which is the body of another woman they killed, and they open up the tomb to open the grave, and they dump her body in there unceremoniously. And also there's this interesting shot of this plane flying over them, which I feel like is a direct World War II reference.
Yeah, as well.
Yeah, like planes flying overhead, and like there's a Louise is the one noticing it, and her face is very tortured as this plane like flies. It's like there are these planes flying over as these like, and of course like a body being dumped into a grave, like obviously recalls mass graves during the Holocaust. And it's as this like unceremonious evil is happening down below, there's this war happening in the sky. So we see Edna's friend now at the police station describing Louise to the police, who was the last person she was seen with. And she says she always wore this thick pearl necklace. And the police say there's like the same pattern of girls going missing, all with the same kind of beauty, all students, all blue eyes. And that to me also points that this is so pathological. Like this is more than just trying to get skin for Christiane's face. Like their eyes don't need to be blue. He's not taking out their eyes, right? Like it's pathological the way that he's creating victims that look like his daughter. He's victimizing his daughter over and over again through the bodies of these other women.
And not, recognizing them as people, but just as new bodies for experiment on. And I see like him also not even just trying to fix his daughter, but trying to just make this happen, trying to make this surgery a reality.
And it also recalls, again, Nazi doctors who were obsessed with blue eyes. And one of the experiments that Nazi doctors used to perform on Jews was like trying to make their eyes blue. So that, of course, if you're living in a post-war society, would be, I think, a reference that people would get.
Yeah.
So we see Dr. Genessier eating dinner with Christiane, and her face is looking quite normal. She's looking very pretty. And he talks about how she will have a new life and a new identity. And Louise talks about how beautiful she is now, how angelic. She's almost more beautiful, they're saying. Through the suffering of this other woman, she has been imbued with this beauty. And the face transplant seems to be a success, but Christiane doesn't recognize herself anymore. She says she looks like she's from the beyond, which is, again, like this like ghost imagery, right? Like she's dead. She's already dead. And she says, what about Jacques, her fiance? And they're like, well, we're just going to have to explain it to him. So Doc gets a call about a patient, and he has to go, and he starts inspecting Christiane's face like very creepily. He says she has these rosy cheeks, and he's examining her, and it's almost like incestuous in this way, like the way he's handling her.
Yeah, I also interpreted that, or I saw someone else interpret that as it was the first sign, I think, maybe of something wrong in the story, and it's him kind of recognizing that, but still being like, but your beautiful face for now, no signs of anything yet. So it stuck out to me when he out in this scene when they're sitting down and speaking, he's like, yes, smile, which is, of course, a misogynistic thing.
Right.
That we hear is smile and why don't you look happy? But then he says, not too much. Like, don't mess up what I've done. Don't be too happy about it. But like, let me see that you're pleased with these results and that I've succeeded. But don't smile too much. It's not
He
not
has
about
so much ownership over her. And when he leaves the room with Louise, he knows immediately. He's like, I failed. And he can see that the transplant is failing. And we cut to this montage of the face transplant. Like, it's just still photos of Christiane's face as the face transplant is rejecting. And Edith Scobb's her acting is so good here, because you see through each photo as like the face transplant is rejecting, like her agony, and through each image she just gets more and more, her eyes, she gets more and more like horrified.
Mm-hmm.
And the face transplant, like the skin starts rotting and the graft has to be removed. So now the mask is back, and Louise is visiting Christiane as she lies on the floor of her room distraught. Christiane also keeps calling Jacques just to hear his voice. And then as she calls him on the phone one time, she whispers his name and he recognizes that it's her. And we hear Louise like, who are you calling? And Christiane says, no one. And she says, the dead keep quiet. And Louise is like assuring her like one day he's going to succeed. And she says he's not going to stop experimenting on me. She's like, I'm basically like one of his dogs. I'm his guinea pig. He acts so benevolent, but he actually enjoys it.
Yeah. And she in this also says something like, can you take one of those shots? I've seen him use it for the dogs. Like, she's asking Louise to euthanize her because she, again, is in the situation of, I'd rather just be dead.
Yeah, she's a prisoner with no face, stuck in her sadistic father's house, and she's begging for death. Jacques goes to the police, swearing it was her on the phone. The police don't believe him, and they say something about like the woman with the pearl choker from the other missing girl case, and he recognizes that pearl choker detail, and he starts putting two and two together. We cut to Louise, who's stalking yet another victim. Like, they're not gonna stop. And we see the earlier in the film, there was like kind of a humorous moment at the police station where one of the detectives is talking to a girl who got caught shoplifting, and he basically like lets her go because she's so cute, and he's like, just don't do it again. And we see that she's back here. She got caught shoplifting again, queen. And they like bribe her, basically. They're like, we won't do anything, like, we're not going to arrest you if you go along with what we need from you. So they ask her to get intel on Louise as a way to like get her out of trouble. So she's going to go undercover as a plant victim for them to prey on. And they know that there's a pathology here because they ask her to bleach her hair to look more like the typical victim, the blue-eyed blonde hair victim. Again, Nazi shit, right?
Yeah.
So they're gonna use her as bait. So they kind of set her up. They're like, you're gonna say that you have, they don't tell her what's going on, but they're like, you're gonna say that you have a migraine, you're gonna go to this doctor who's gonna bring you to Genesier's clinic. And Genesier sees the girl in the hospital, and he's kind of like, examining her like, she looks like Christiane. There's this interesting, I'm wondering about what your opinion on this is. Genesier goes to see this little boy that he's treating, And he asks him to say how many fingers he's holding up, but the boy can't tell him the correct answer. And he gives the boy's mother hope that he can save him, but then upon leaving implies that the prognosis is bad. What do you think of this moment with the little boy?
Yeah, I read something that this scene is maybe removed in certain versions of the film. And that it was mentioned, I need to find the note on this, but that this person's opinion was that it kind of humanized him and made him seem more like he was trying to do positive things for other people. But I feel like this just drives home for me that he's like, yeah, I'll just lie about these procedures and that I can do them. And yeah, maybe it'll get better, even though it's like we're seeing yet another example of his work failing. And he's still like, let me give hope to the mother. Let me, even though, there's an obvious error there. So I feel like for me, it doesn't humanize him. If anything, it oh, it's not even about your daughter. It's about you want to keep trying out these experiments on whoever, and whether you fail or not, you're just going to keep up this persona of, I'm this respected, surgeon and I control everything. So yeah, maybe it'll get better.
I'm really glad you brought up the humanizing thing, because I wanted to discuss this. This is something I kept seeing in the texts about how he's humanized, he's more nuanced. I watched a Guillermo del Toro interview about this movie because it's one of his favorite movies, and he was like, oh, the father is like very humanized because he like obviously wants to help his daughter. I just hate men? But
is that the problem?
Because I do not think that this man is humanized. I think he's like a horrible sadist.
Yeah, and he gives that to me I think it becomes more apparent as I rewatch this movie also, but from the jump, he's a surgeon, he's standing up on a stage. Surgeons immediately give me sadist vibes.
Yes.
He in no way, in the ways that he's described kind of in text throughout this as this he was a pretty normal guy. And I'm like, in what world is this guy a normal guy? He seems horrible.
He's a creep.
I'm like, is that me?
Do we just hate men? I feel like I don't see the humanization.
I said, I hate a man who takes himself too seriously.
Yeah, 100%. Fuck this guy. I understand that Franju tried to humanize him a little bit to please the censors, so he didn't look like a crazy Nazi doctor, but I think he still looks like that. I don't know. That's I don't sympathize with him at all. I sympathize with Christiane, and I think she's being controlled by this insane patriarch who's hell-bent on proving that he can control, that he's a god, that he can control the limits of the body.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw something else described as his inability to accept failure was really his main flaw in this, and how he gets stuck in this cycle of just wanting to continue to find this experiment. And I agree that he definitely sees himself in this godlike way. And it reminded me a lot of the quote from Frankenstein, also a mad doctor, a scientist in this scenario, that saying, now I know what it feels like to be God. And how Genesee probably sees himself very much in this way, and having this control of science and being outside of being able to manipulate the body in a way that is rejecting the way that God created it to be, and treats these bodies as very disposable. He doesn't think of them as life. They're just more for him to play with in his godlike capacity. And it also, I was re-listening to your episode about New French Extremity and the idea, this like French idea of God is dead being something that is very popular this time. And I think that kind of speaking to probably Franju's view of the Catholic Church here as well, of like it's rejected, and we're seeing kind of how the power of how Genesee sees himself maybe reflects that in some way.
Yeah, that's a really good point to remember, that Franju was also very anti the church. And yeah, I think there's this, Genesee is kind of the stand-in for the church, for these institutions here.
Yeah.
The church that thinks it controls your body. And yeah, I don't really see Franju as being super sympathetic to this character. I think that he is humanized, but that doesn't mean that he is sympathetic. Like, I think we see, again, it's a banality of evil thing. Like, he is just a man, but he is also horrible and drunk with power. So now we see the shoplifting girl hooked up to this kind of like electrotherapy. It's all very mechanical and scary. I think that in this scene, the medical equipment is like really heavily emphasized as like something scary, and it's in like arcane or like archaic, and like, but also very futuristic. And the doctor is frustrated. He's clearly feeling down. The nurse brings him the chart of the thief girl, and he's like, you can release her. There's nothing wrong with her. And the girl asks to make a call as she's leaving the hospital, and she calls her mom and tells her that she's coming home and she'll see her in a bit, and that she'll take the bus back to Paris. But as she walks down this dark, scary street, Louise pulls up alongside her and offers her a ride as the carnival music comes on, Louise's theme. And so the fiance and the police are chatting, remarking that the girl left already. And the police think that that's the end of it. Their suspicions were just a hunch. But Genesee is immediately back on his bullshit. He's trying to cut off her face. And Louise lets him know, as he's about to do this operation, that two men have come to the door and he has to come immediately. And what's really weird about this scene is we see that Christiane was in the operating room with her mask on, watching the operation. And I was really struck by that on this watch. I was like, why is she there? And it just adds to the horrors of it all. I don't know, like just her in the corner watching her new face being taken off of this victim.
Yeah, it makes me wonder kind of, do you think that this was maybe a situation where she's becoming interested or obsessed with the process? Or do you think she's still kind of disgusted by it? And do you think maybe he's making her watch these things?
I hate him, so I feel like he's making her watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it's almost like, look at what I'm doing for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's creepy that she's there. And the police are asking Genesee questions about the girl that was released from his care earlier that day and how she never turned up at her mother's house. Jacques walks into the clinic. The police leave and he shows them out, and Genesee stands at the door watching them go. We cut back to the girl on the operating table, and she's strapped down to the table with forceps on her face, and the daughter is watching her, and she's like, Christiane is watching her, and she's so like, I feel like she really sympathizes with this girl in this moment. Christiane walks over again, and she looms over her, and she grabs this scalpel, and the girl like wakes up, and she's like crying, and she's like struggling and trying to get out of her bindings, and she's got this these forceps on her face, like she's about to get her face cut off. And Christiane grabs this scalpel, and you can tell she's really scared because, you know, she thinks that this creepy masked figure is about to kill her. And instead, she uses the scalpel to set her free from her restraints. And Louise comes in, and she stabs Louise in the neck right through that pearl necklace. Like, very symbolic. The pearl necklace, right? It's like femininity, right? It's like this, you know, it's not just like any necklace that she's wearing there. It's this like very feminine pearl choker. It's like very symbolic. She's stabbing her right where she's got her scar and right through this like very feminine symbol. And as Louise is dying, she's like, why? It's like, girl, you know why. So you had some thoughts on the necklace.
Yes. When you first told me to, you know, pick out a movie, we talked about, we wanted to have something that has kink themes, obviously, because that's where a lot of my work comes from. And so I was trying to kind of analyze aspects of this, and the way that it comes up as this is something to hide her scar, it feels very much like something the doctor gave to her and feels reminiscent of a collar to me in that way, because it's very much like this thing, that this scar that is there is the thing that causes him to be able to have this power over her because he transformed her, and how she does feel very indebted to him, and like she's owned by him in some way.
I feel like I could write a whole dissertation on necklaces in horror films as collars. Yeah. Like we were just watching Saw X.
Yes.
And Amanda is literally wearing a collar in that movie. Mm-hmm. Like this is something that comes up over and over again in horror films. I feel like there's something here. And I've been working on my book proposal for years about like sadomasochism in horror, and I feel like this is a really,
chapter in
it's a whole chapter. Yeah. So Louise, as her death acting, Elida Valley, she's acting down boots. Like she
love her as an actress. Like.
Yeah. She like slumps over in death. The girl who was being held hostage runs away, and Christiane goes into the room with the dogs, and she frees all the dogs from their cages. And the doctor opens the door for the dog room, and the dogs fucking hate his ass, and they start attacking him, and they get revenge on their master. They tear him to pieces.
Yeah.
I love that. And Christiane also sets all of the birds free, all of these white doves. Very symbolic, setting all of the animals, again, that animal symbolism, like, because there was also a scene that we didn't even mention where Genesee is working on a dog.
Yes.
And he's experimenting on a dog. And this, you know, the animals are very much compared to Christiane here as the victim in this film.
Yeah.
And so she sets all the doves free, and then she sees the doctor lays there dead, and now his face is mutilated.
Mm-hmm. And his eyeball is just bulging out, and yes. Everything is torn apart, and I love to see abusers die, you know?
I do too. It's so satisfying. It's such a satisfying ending.
Yes.
And Christiane walks free into the night with this dove balanced on her hand. And it's like this really surreal, beautiful image. And we're like wondering where she's going to go, what she's going to do. Is she going to decide to live? Is she walking off to her death? We don't we don't know, but she's free. And if she decides to live or die, she's going to be doing it on her own terms. And I love that ending so much.
Yeah.
And then that music comes in.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful ending.
So that is Eyes Without a Face, Misha. We did it.
Yes.
Absolutely love this movie.
I have more thoughts.
Please tell me.
Well, I started looking at there. Obviously, this film has huge influence. Like, it has influenced so many things because of how iconic it is. So I looked into a lot of those things. If you want me to,
I would love to. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, one of the films that I revisited when we started talking about this was I noticed a lot of similar imagery, and also because this was a film that I was introduced to pretty much around the same time that I found Eyes Without a Face, was Roz Williams' short film Pig, if you've seen it.
Oh, I've never seen it.
I rewatched it when I was looking at this, and it really like pulls so much from this. Like, it starts with this ominous driving scene that has all these creepy environmental shots, but then leads into, ultimately a torture scene that is very reminiscent in the shots. The whole thing is also shot in black and white, but it shows this graphic genitorture scene, and it, like, the way that it's shot is so reminiscent of Eyes Without a Face, and like these long lasting detailed shots of this medical torture. But I thought that was interesting also because it's a male on male scene, so we're seeing this like queerness that was like influenced from this film also, and how that was represented in that way, which I thought was interesting. And there's nowhere that cites Eyes Without a Face as a reference, but they both, Pig and Eyes Without a Face, cite Dali and Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou as a reference for both of them, which I can
totally
in both for sure. But that, I think there's like lots of leather elements that show up in Pig that like helped me kind of draw the connections between sadomasochism in my life as like compared to medical horror and body horror as a whole, and kind of how those things connect.
Yeah, I love that connection. I'll have to watch that. There's definitely a lot of like beautiful sadomasochistic imagery in this film that it's kind of ripe for that, even though it's not like maybe as explicit as some other horror films that I've talked about on this podcast, or like it's got a lot of other historical baggage going on. But I think about something like The Night Porter, which is also very sadomasochistic, and it's using sadomasochism as this motif or this metaphor to talk about the horrors of World War II. And post like war in the 1970s, this whole genre of
make this summer count with Harvard Summer School. With Harvard's free college programs, high school students gain confidence and insight into what college is all about, challenge themselves, and discover new friends. There are over 200 courses to choose from, including college credit courses, so it's the ideal way for students to learn something new, but most importantly, have fun. Visit info.summer.harvard.edu/Spotify to learn more.
Is it time to reimagine your future? The right business skills may make a difference in your career. At Capella University, we offer a relevant education that's designed to focus on what you need to know in the business world. We'll teach professional skills to help you pursue your goals, like business management, strategic planning, and effective communication. And you can apply these skills right away. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Like sadomasochistic Nazi exploitation films was also being produced, like Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, something like that. And there's the big focal point in these films is like medical torture, because it's just ripe for that kind of sadomasochistic imagery. And lots of medfet inspiration in this movie for sure.
I picked out this quote that Franju is speaking about when he originally made Blood of the Beast, which was his first documentary film talking about violence, where he says, "Violence is not an end, it is the weapon which sensitizes the spectator and which lets him see what's lyric or poetic beyond or above the violence, and or what's tender in the reality. Violence for me is like a means, like blasphemy for Buñuel." And so I think that, in this, he's using this violent imagery as a tool to highlight these things that have gone on and how we use this as a symbol. And I kind of see that reflected in sadomasochism. We do the same thing. We use violence as a tool to kind of express our creativity and recontextualize, scenarios. And I thought it was interesting to see so much influence in the short film by Roz Williams Pig, because this makes me kind of think, as these two gay men in leather pants with a leather hood, is this kind of speaking to that as following the AIDS crisis, because that film came out in the 90s, and how maybe there were connections drawn there between the medical atrocities of that in comparison to the way that Franju uses that of the atrocities of World War II.
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. I mean, just like the medical trauma is such a ripe theme for horror. Yeah. A question I wanted to ask you, Misha, since we're talking about feeling godlike when manipulating bodies, do you feel godlike when you're doming?
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely feels like that, especially, I don't know, in having I don't know, I think I also medical scenes are very popular among the types of freaks that I hang out with. But it does feel like when you're in these scenarios, you're being given this access to create experiences that aren't available in a day-to-day, which can feel very godlike, because you have this power to create these feelings and incite these feelings into people through body horror, through sadomasochism, and it gives you a crazy high. And then
absolutely.
I'll hear people talk about it to me too, and the way that they experience bottoming and how out of their body it feels. And I feel the same with topping. I get into this space where I'm like, oh, I'm God. And I've had clients say things to me like that in scenarios where they're like, you're God. And it's hard for it to not fuck with your head at a certain point. But that's why we have to have a healthy relationship with power.
Well, that's why it's an equal exchange of power, and it's power exchange, not being drunk on power. And,
exactly. Yeah.
As much as when I'm doming, I do feel godlike, I also it's never far from my mind how lucky I am that the person is letting me do this stuff.
Exactly.
And is enjoying it, and again, it's a power exchange instead of like enacting power on someone's body. It's wanted and symbiotic, and masochists or people who are bottoming also feel like really powerful in that moment, that they can take what you're dishing out.
Absolutely.
So that's the really like the crux of what makes us different than someone like je ne sais.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's consensual, but I feel like I think that a lot of my friends who are, myself included, who are drawn towards medical fetish do also, I mean, this is not true for everyone, I'm sure, but have some level of medical trauma.
Totally.
And we reinterpret that, and we use that as a way to create these scenes that can subvert that and give us a new perspective on it. And I feel like it's super, similar to the way that directors look at horror. They look at these horrible things. They find ways to create scenarios and films and art that is beautiful out of them. But like, it does come from this darker place sometimes. But I don't know, like, we definitely, we learn to eroticize our fears. I had a pretty horrible experience with dental surgery earlier this year that definitely hammered in my surgeons are sadists belief. But after that, my medical fetish up 100%. Like,
I mean, that's also such a good point too, because this film is like really built, a lot of the symbolism is built on this national trauma. And the way that we process trauma and transmute it into beauty and art and sex is like one of my favorite things about human beings. And I mean, Franju created something so singular and so beautiful out of absolute abject horror, and it's like such a poetic film, and it's there's like all the gory imagery is like really, really beautiful. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you'd want to say from your notes?
I feel like that gives a lot of my feelings about this. I think we've shared a lot, and I have learned a lot as well.
Yeah, I feel really happy with how we covered this film. Misha, where can the people find you on social media?
Yes. You can find me at my website, which is luxuryevil.com. Easy to remember. But you can also find me at Micha Malvada on pretty much every platform. If you're having a hard time, just Google me. It usually pops everything up.
Yeah, and you should hire Misha.
I'm so scary. If anyone wants to do an Eyes Without a Face inspired medfet scene, I'm here to make it happen.
Oh my God, can I be Christiane in the corner with my mask on watching?
Yes. It dripped out in Givenchy in the corner.
Yes. And you know where to find me. You should know where to find me by now. Girls Guts Giallo on Instagram. Girls Guts Giallo X on X. I'm on Blue Sky as Girls Guts Giallo. I don't know if Blue Sky is really going to pop off, but we'll see. And again, sign up for my Patreon. Patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. This is how I make all my money. I say this every episode. I'm like a broken record, but if you like what I do, it would mean the world to me if you would go and support me financially in my endeavors so I can keep doing this and keep making episodes for you. Thank you so much, Misha, for doing this and re-recording and just being amazing and taking so many amazing notes and being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me and talking about this film with me. And it was such an honor to be on your podcast.